You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. Thanks for listening. I'm today's host, April Lawson.
And I'm Monica Guzman.
Yeah, and we're joined today by a wonderful guest, Sally Kohn. Sally, thank you so much for joining us today.
You know, I think the wonderful part remains to be seen, but I appreciate the positivity.
I have confidence in you. I do.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Nice to be on with both of you.
Yeah. Well, so Sally, I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about yourself so that listeners know who you are and, why you're wonderful. Tell us why you're wonderful.
I'm the least qualified person to answer that question. What am I? Who are any of us? I have to tell you, like, these questions that I used to be very good at answering once upon a time. In the era of coronavirus, I feel like identity is meaningless, and also my brain is mush. So it's not like I can come up with some clever answer here. So I'm just going to go with the straightforward truth, which is that I am a TV commentator, a writer, an activist. People may have seen my TED Talks or read my book, The Opposite of Hate, or seen me on TV or heard me before on this podcast. But mostly I spend my time trying to help social justice causes and organizations and advocates and in the US and internationally do what they're doing better.
Wonderful. See, I didn't think your brain smush. I think that was really good. That's way better than I would do in this circumstance.
Feels like swimming through Jello these days.
Yeah, I think that's true for all of us.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I think so. Thank you for that. And we just wanted to start by hearing a little bit about how you got here, because as a person who has watched and loves your TED Talk, I think that there's I may not have watched all of them. I've watched the recent one.
Which one? I'm
just teasing. Yeah.
It's
the opposite of hate.
There's no pretentious way to say I have multiple. There's no non-pretentious.
That's actually true.
To say I have multiple TED Talks.
Like what would you possibly?
It's like
No,
it's
just no
in
option.
fact, I've found the only way to do it is to actually up the pretension level. To be like, well, as I said in my 3 TED Talks.
That's right. Well, anyway, so in the TED Talk that I listened to, and forgive me that it's just the one so far, I'm interested in, you talked about how your early life had led to this passion of yours for fighting hate, understanding it and fighting it. And I'd love to know, just sort of tell us about that and about how you came to this as a mission, because I think it's a mission a lot of people have, but they come to it in really different ways.
Oh my gosh, I haven't thought about that in a while. Well, I think hopefully like a lot of people, maybe not like enough people, I was sort of raised to be a do-gooder type, to care about the world, to care about my community, my neighbors, etc. But I didn't have a real grasp of sort of endemic structural injustice until really college. And I went in sort of search of that. My experience, I had a very strange coming out experience in high school where my parents were actually very, 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 very supportive. But my then girlfriend's parents weren't. And so in this sort of very interesting way, right, I had the privilege of having a very comforting and supportive sort of core nuclear family environment. At the same time, I was exposed to injustice in a way that, I'd only ever read about in books. And it is often the case for a lot of people who grew up sort of privileged and, economically and racially, et cetera. And so being exposed to that sort of sparked my hunger to understand and explore injustice more broadly. And I was very fortunate then that I just fell in with a really amazing set of mentors, chief among them Irva Shivad, who is the sort of leading thinker then as now in the intersection of race and sexuality, especially in movement spaces, and really opened my whole mind, my activism, my life, my world to thinking about structural inequality, structural injustice, my role in perpetuating it, and my part in solving it.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask a question, Sally, that I bet
that's your job. I'm glad you want to ask a question.
Yes, I want to ask a question. Here we go.
If you did.
I want to ask a question that I bet a lot of liberals who follow you have had. One of the early sort of notable things in your career as a media commentator is that you were on Fox News. You were the lesbian liberal commentator on Fox
Gird
News,
yourself, right? To say that you were on.
Yes.
Deep breath.
Fox News. Exactly. It comes to people as a bit of a shock. So when you talk about how you grew up feeling injustices very personally, wanting to fight for them from this place, I think a lot of people want to know what made you accept that job with Fox News to begin with, and then tell us how it went.
Yeah. So I sort of from college, after college, through graduate school, I was a community organizer. So I spent my career, my free time, working with a number of organizations and a number of causes, predominantly helping and supporting and taking my cues from grassroots organizations that were trying to make the world a better place, whether on issues of carceral injustice or queer rights or healthcare reform or immigration rights, you name it. And I really fell into the whole media pundit thing because someone saw me giving a speech, actually talking on a panel at a conference, and came up to me afterwards and said, "You would be really great." Oh, see, do you hear the kid?
I do. All right,
it's
okay. It's COVID. It's COVID reality.
It's okay. Watch what we're going to do. We're going to move outside. Just hang on.
Live, folks. It's happening. Real life.
You know what? It's because it's shady. There's a little spot of shade now. I couldn't do this before.
Oh, awesome.
But yeah, it's you're gonna end up on you're still gonna end up on my lap, but we're just gonna have to make it work.
No, that's great.
Yeah, it's pretty insanely hot today, but
okay. What are you gonna do?
I mean, I definitely got a sunburn from my previous conference calls today. I'm not complaining. This is not a complaint.
Wow.
Okay, wait, hang on.
Yep.
Okay, fine. I think we're gonna be fine.
Okay.
So someone saw you on a panel.
Right, yes. So someone, clearly, because I was so hyper articulate, like when I forgot my train of thought. Anyway, someone saw me on a panel and came up to me afterwards and said, "You have to be on television." I said, "No, I do not. I didn't have a television. I watched cable news. I thought it was garbage. Still think it's garbage." One thing led to another. I was sort of really, really resistant. And then I realized, oh, this is a lot like organizing, right? You get to, reach people and persuade them and engage them and inspire them and motivate them. It's just instead of like 10 people in a church basement, you've got like 1 million people on TV, but it's the same fundamentals. The other thing is to be really clear about the Fox piece. And, I was very morally and politically conflicted about the whole thing. And in fact, even, by the way, not even just like taking a job there, before I even took a job there, when I went on air there, I had to call all my friends who were organizing all the campaigns to shut down Fox and ask them what they thought. And, movements have different facets, political campaigns, and I mean that in a small sense of, issue campaigns, tactically, they have multiple different tactics and angles and strategies. And at the end of the day, what I and people who I was listening to said was, it's that old adage, like, why do you rob banks? It's because it's where the money is, right? If you're in the game of persuading people, and if you see it as, and I think, again, like lots of people who are communicators and movement folks have different, purposes, different strategies, different strategic uses, right? But I knew one of the things I could do was reach people who were like me in background, racially, economically, etc., but didn't agree with me, and had, for a whole host of reasons, because of the family I'd grown up with, because my temperament, had a willingness to have those conversations. And so, just like you rob banks because it's where the money is, you go and talk on Fox News because it's where the people are. And incidentally, at the time, even there were more Democrats watching Fox News than MSNBC or CNN combined. This is a big audience. That's that.
And how did it go? I mean, what was? Let me phrase it this way. What did you make of that decision now, looking back and having written the book about standing against hate and having had the experience of doing something that, for many folks on one side of the political divide, is just, how could you? How could you go right into the lion's den of whatever side you happen to be on? Crossing into the other sounds terrible, awful, blah, blah, blah. What is your review of the experience?
I mean, I could go back and I could say, like, this is how it changed me. This is how it made a difference. How how I helped impact people. And I could cite examples, sort of micro and macro, where it did. The truth is, the experience, maybe more than I changed others. I think I did. It changed me, right? So I think, even if you'd asked me before, about my notions of sort of who's a good person, who's a bad person, right? Why these people believe this way, and why these people believe this way. And I would have been sort of self-aware enough to not say, like, oh, well, people vote this way because they're bad people or whatever. But in my heart, I probably thought that, right? That, people who agreed with me politically, voted the way I did, believed the things I did on issues, were better people. Smarter, more enlightened, more, caring, better intentioned, better people, superior. And I'm not saying I don't still sometimes lean towards some of those views, but being at Fox really opened my mind and my heart to the fact that people I don't agree with aren't necessarily bad people.
Yeah. And
that people aren't monoliths politically. That in fact, and it's one of the things I explored in the book, we want, it's a convenience, and in a way it's a convenience to ourselves, to those of us on the sort of whatever side of the aisle we're on, that to believe that there's something inherently superior or just inherently different about us, such that we couldn't do those horrible things. The truth is, right, like, everyone can do or believe horrible things. Everyone can be kind, everyone can be mean. Conservatives can be compassionate and caring, and liberals and progressives can be heartless and racist, right? So, this notion of this sort of inherent goodness or worth in one versus the other is really a fundamentally problematic concept that often a lot of liberals use to mask their own culpability and avoid accountability.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that because actually there are several questions about this, but the first one is just, I'd like to, you talk about being against hate, right? And there are undoubtedly some straightforward definitions of hate, but also some more complex ones. And I'd like to ask, what is hate? But also, I think that when people see somebody on the other side of the aisle, and so for you, I gather it would be, Trump supporters or whatever. We interview Red sometimes, for whom it would be, the liberals with their progressive orthodoxy or whatever. I think that people often, they attribute both, especially their own emotion, but even if they're feeling generous, the other side's emotions to, well, they just feel threatened, or change is hard, or, if I was out of a job, I might vote for a crazy man too, or like, whatever that is. And obviously I'm caricaturing it a little bit, but honestly, I think that people have a lot of trouble characterizing the other side and characterizing themselves in a way that is honest.
It's not just honest, right? It's
yeah.
compassionate, right? Like it's, I finally,
And
by the
real
way, realized I
compassionate.
could set my, I'm breaking, you know, I'm like I do media and speaking training, and I actually train people now how to like be on Zooms, and I'm breaking every rule. But finally I realized, oh, I could set the thing here. Sorry, this is what happens. It's Thursday afternoon. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Coronavirus, man.
yeah. You know what finally hit home for me was realizing that I wanted people who don't agree with me, and not just people who don't agree with me politically, but people who don't agree with my life choices, as it were, to nonetheless see me as a worthy human being, deserving of the equality and dignity that they believe themselves to deserve. And when I thought about it that way, I realized, well, oh, wait, then I guess I should give it to them too, right? In other words, that my sense of their fundamental rights, deservedness, equity, dignity, decency, and that they should be treated that way shouldn't be dependent on them feeling that way about me. That was a really, I mean, like conceptually, that is a really easy thing to say. It is a really hard thing.
Totally.
Especially when you feel like it's so easy to say, well, but they, you know, but they don't this, but they don't that, but they don't, and they may never. And at the end of the day, you know, I guess another way of thinking about this is, you know, whose moral standard am I holding myself to? Right? Mine or theirs. I mean, this is sort of very similar, like when we see now in the kind of era of Trump, and people are like, oh, well, Trump said that, and Trump did that, or Trump supporters did this, or so therefore we can too. It's like, well, wait a second, whose moral standard are we now embracing? That's why, you know, I don't think you stoop to that level, even in the face of hate. It's both tactical, right? No one has ever been hated into changing their mind. If you really want people to change their minds, if you really don't want them to vote the same way next time, etc., no one's ever been hated into it. But it is also moral, right? If you don't believe that's how people should behave, then you, at the very least, should not behave that way.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, you've brought up, Sally, that you once talked to your Twitter trolls, I believe it was, right? And you actually got their stories and heard them out. And that one of your big takeaways from that experience was that nobody thinks they're mean.
Yeah.
So when I hear April ask the question about what is hate, I also think probably most people think that hate is what other people do. But when they, so when you know what I mean? Like, help us through that, right? So you have to.
Nobody thinks they're hateful. I mean, by the way, if you like go and talk to, like, I mean, I spent more time with kind of ex-neo-Nazis and ex-terrorists and as part of the book research, because I was interested in that journey away from hate. But if you talk to current neo-Nazis and current terrorists, and you read the literature and research on talking to these folks, what you realize is that they don't think they're hateful, right? It's actually, most commonly, they will say, well, some other group is hateful, right? And they are just responding, right? They are, it's the sort of, we tend to have a they started it first mentality around hate and otherizing and sort of all of these things. And again, sometimes, here's the thing, sometimes that's not inaccurate, right? And the deep irony is that, you know, if you look at the dynamics between, say, the, you know, extremely hateful, you know, aggressively mean anti-gay protesters and LGBT rights activists and queer folk in general, like, you look at the imbalance of power and the imbalance, I think I'm biased, but I think if you kind of stood back and looked at those two behaviors, you'd say, oh, they're being really, really mean. They over there just want to like throw glitter and live their lives and like be treated equally, you know? So the fact then that it's often the groups that are disempowered, marginalized, on the sort of losing end of society's power imbalance equations are the ones to, hold up that moral model, to be the ones to move beyond hate, to be, right, isn't fair. That's part of the reason I think allyship and solidarity and these concepts of sort of, leading across identities is so important. But, at the end of the day, again, like moral leadership is moral leadership. When we talk about it in those terms, it's never because it was easy, it's because it was right.
So I, again, sort of multiple places to go with this, but just before we move off of this, I want to ask.
I should say, I'm sorry. I think I screwed up. So I have maybe 20 more minutes.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No problem.
Cool.
So I'm interested in how, right. So we've talked about how nobody thinks they're mean. Everybody thinks hate is what other people do. But what I'd love to do is give our listeners a way to say, how do I identify this in me, right? Because one of the hardest things is to own your own hate. And it's totally true that like we all have it, but also I mean, I'll just speak for myself. Only in retrospect can I often identify where something came from and that it wasn't actually cool. And I'm interested in how do you, so like, is there a litmus test? Like, that's why I'm talking about like a real practical version of what is hate. Like, how do I see it, own it, and like, I can want to fix it all I want, but yeah.
There's a sort of a reverse golden rule kind of application here, right? Which is if someone did it unto you, would you think it was messed up? Right? So, I mean, it's look, my very broad definition, and I have a pretty broad definition of hate and otherizing really, which is treating other people or other groups of people as less than or viewing them as less than because of who they are or what they believe. Now, under that broad definition, we could all sit here and very quickly think of at least one. Right? And I use this example with my liberal friends and liberal audiences because, I talk about how like, right after the 2016 election, all my liberal friends would all, we were all day drinking. It's come full circle, day drinking again. Anyway, we'd all be day drinking and these like very impassioned, very high-minded progressives would be saying things like, oh, I can't believe these people who voted for Trump, they're racist and they're anti-immigrant and they're Islamophobic and they're so hateful and I hate them. And it's interesting, right? I mean, there's actually, by the way, deep research that I get into in the book about how a lot of our relationship to hate is actually in-group, out-group behavior and is really about social bonding with those we perceive to be an in-group and as actually more malleable ideologically than we believe it to be. That's when you really get into that, it's deeply disturbing, right? That in fact, a lot of people who hold deeply, overtly problematic, hateful views, in fact, their attachment to those views is rather loose. And what's true is that they were seeking out some sense of belonging and then they bonded and deepened their commitment to hate through that belonging, which is like, right? But the truth is, I know a lot of liberals who hang out and bond over how much they hate Trump or whatever. I don't care if you hate Trump as much, leaders are different than followers, but how much they hate, whatever, or just how much they hate, not even that, how much do they hate Trump voters, right? Or, Obama voters or whatnot, like it's the broad strokes, right? And, okay. I mean, if you really want to like, absolution that your hate is not as bad as other people's hate, fine, but it's still hate.
Good point. Yeah.
And this makes me think of, for a lot of folks today, it feels like any message against hate is a call to be nice. And any call to be nice is an invitation to be weak, to be ground, to not fight for what needs to be fought for. How do you tackle that?
It's in some level I don't, right? Like on some level, people have to carve their own journey, and I'm not in the position of, you know, being the civility or you know,
Police,
decency
right.
or you know, anti-hate nanny or something, right? Like that to me is counterproductive, because then what you're also doing is you're drawing in effect a false kind of moral dichotomy between people who are, you know, hateful or not, or people who are quote unquote nice or not, or etc. I do think that, you know, I have come to believe in my own life that kindness and standing up for the dignity of all people, and actually meaning all people, in the face, often literally in the face of people who do not, is one of the highest forms of strength that there is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's, you can't
Yeah.
necessarily convince everyone of that. And I think it's partly where people have to go through their own individual journey. And you know, to me, the question is always like, well, what's your goal? Right? If your goal is, you know, to just carve a literal and metaphorical wall between you and them and stay on the us side and they're the them, and fine, go ahead. Like, right, if your goal is actually to change people's minds, right, whether it's your uncle or your town or a whole side of the aisle or whatever, well, then you're going to have to figure out if that's the most effective way to do it, let alone if that's consistent with your own moral standards.
So to play devil's advocate for a second, I think that, so I'm a conservative, and also I care a whole lot about the issue of sexual violence. And from both of those perspectives, it can seem a lot like convincing people is a great thing to try, but that honestly, like and I would have to say, parts of me wish this weren't true, but it does seem like things to a certain degree change through force. I think it's both, right? Like you persuade some people, and then also the power structures change. And I'm just interested in, it does seem like there is some amount of just social force and winning and losing that drives this stuff. And so I'm interested then in how you participate in a bridge building movement and in a bridge building like line of work. And just to say this is like a question I personally struggle with a lot, and also not enable and own and lift up a culture of forgiveness for really awful things, for things that like, or of, boy, it's just amazing what people get away with in this society against certain groups of people. And one of which, by the way, of course, is women, which is over 50%, right? Like, it's amazing what people get away with. And if we as a society, I'm sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but prioritize differently, right? Like, if we prioritize that, it would be different. And yet, but we don't, because our culture is filled with, we have a culture of forgiveness, not looking at it, whatever. So how do we do what we're doing now?
Interesting. There's a lot I want to unpack in what you said, and we're not going to get into all of it, obviously, but there's so much in there. And one is, first of all, that, you know, we make these it's just again, those of us on the left, and I you know, I spend most of my time talking to people on the left. Why? Well, because I'm not much of a finger wagger at the other side, and I also don't think I'm the most useful advocate, right? I'm not the most useful messenger to people who vehemently disagree with me. I think a fairly useful messenger to kind of people who are on the fence and leaning toward my side. That's generally been my you know, audience, and not even necessarily at this point the kind of far left who sometimes agree with me, sometimes don't, whatever. Point is, on the sort of liberal left, what we tend to do is we say, oh, we don't want people put in boxes. Good example of how we do it is we put conservatives in boxes. We assume that, well, the minute you say conservative, I assume you believe a whole set of things, and look at you going and proving me wrong, right? So, I mean, that's the first thing, is like, it's always we are all so much more interesting than our labels. Totally. And, you know, one of the things that just drives me batty is I'll do a, you know, conservative talk radio show, and, you know, the host will say something like, oh, we disagree on 90 98% of things. And I'll say, whoa, we probably don't.
Mm.
We probably agree on 98% of things. It's just not the things we talk about.
Right.
Right? Because we all, and certainly our media, are all fixated on and that 2% is incredibly important. And it's not to say, and that's also not to sort of say like, oh, let's all link arms and sing Kumbaya. And it is an actual recognition of the fact that there are probably things we agree on that we don't even acknowledge, so we don't have a framework for recognizing our common ground, not falsely embracing it or bowing to it, or but just actually seeing what is there. So that's point number one. You know, to your other point, and there's a lot of interesting things in what you said, but you know, forgiveness is a really interesting concept. I think we have, that is an idea that, you know, there are all these concepts in psychology that say that we want people to be, and this is related, right, to this conversation about sort of when I'm hateful versus when others are hateful or whatever. I don't label it as hate in myself, but I label it as hate in them. There's all these sort of psychological phenomena that we as human beings do where we want people to forgive us. We don't want to be forgiven. I would say, incidentally, that, you know, one of the more interesting things about the left-right, if we're looking at it in broad terms in the United States, is that at an individual and kind of community level experience, I'd say that the center-right tends to have more of a culture of forgiveness. Whereas at the institutional and kind of policy level, the the center-left has more of a vision of forgiveness. Right, but we often have more trouble with it in practice, right? Where you have more trouble with it in theory. So I actually think that forgiveness, right? If we unpack it, right? Forgiveness is the idea that people can change. We happen to be at a very, you know, at a sort of moment in history and time, and certainly politically, but in general, where we just don't believe people can change.
Totally.
And you know, and again, but we believe we can change. and squaring that circle, untangling that knot is, to me, seems quite essential to us all progressing forward in some more equitable, just, and connected way.
Very interesting. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, I want to know if you feel like an endangered species, and here's what I mean. Here's what I mean. You are able to speak. No. Hang on.
Oh, you
are able to speak from a place where you can see what the left does and what the right does, and you can speak generously of both sides because you have experienced being with both sides. I'm afraid that you're an endangered species. I'm afraid that everyone is resolving to the left and the right so fully in their identities that they cannot even go up enough levels to see these comparisons and contrasting views. I have the book right here. You said the opposite of hate is connection.
Yes.
It feels like there's so much disconnection. So I guess this is my hope, my sort of, where do you find question? Because how many media pundits are there who can even say what you've been saying generously about both sides? How many communicators are even putting out this kind of viewpoint?
So, well, putting out versus being aired, right?
Okay, fair.
I mean, in fairness, here's the like damning statement to the nature of sort of cable news and the social media and the kind of, right, is that we have an environment that, right, certainly driven by social media. One could argue like what drove it before social media. It wasn't necessarily that social media invented it or whatever, but where we, conflict and narrowcasting and not just preaching to your own choir, but riling up your side of the aisle is privileged, right? And prioritized and rewarded. Right? So like if I pile on to somebody on the internet, I don't pay a social cost, right? Whereas if I defend someone, especially someone who's not on my side, big cost, there's a risk. Now, sometimes you take that risk, sometimes you don't, but the point is like the calculus. And that's not an opinion, right? I mean, that's just it is what it is, right? We don't, you see takedowns in the media. You don't see whatever we don't even have a language for it. What's a take up? A put up? I don't even know what we call it. So there's
no one's modeling it, or if they do, they don't get rewarded.
Well, that's it. It's also not right. So I mean, so for example, just to give you a peek behind the curtain, there were times where, you know, and I've certainly gone through eras of being more strident, less so, right? I mean, I definitely was more strident again, and more sort of scorched earthy right after Trump was elected. And then, you know, right, like I'm always, a lot of us are, I think. But to be fair, there have been times where, you know, I'd be called by a producer, and what's your opinion on blah, blah, blah? Well, my opinion's a little complicated. I kind of think this, I kind of think that. I think that side has a good argument. I think you don't get booked.
You don't get booked, right?
You don't get booked.
Exactly.
So, and then even if you do get booked, those aren't the clips that go viral. You know, they aren't, right? So we have a society that has, at that elite level, right? And at that sort of public level, right? Because Twitter isn't, I mean, you know, isn't by and large has become a fairly elite tool anyway, even though the masses participate in it. It's like, it's the way what's trending, it's what's right. And that's lifted up by certain elites. It's at that top level, right? We only see the conflict. In fact, we incentivize the conflict. That being said, here's the interesting thing is anyone you could name, we won't play this game now, but anyone you could name on either side of the aisle with maybe 4 or 5 exceptions on each side, off camera, off stage, behind the scenes, is more nuanced, more generous, more conciliatory, more, I mean, they just are. Because that's human nature. It's actually, this is Brene Brown says it's hard to hate people up close.
Yep.
It just is.
Even the media pundits, right? Even the media pundits have their camera. Well, because we see them perform and we're supposed to buy what we see because they're selling it.
Right.
What choice do we have?
But that in and of itself is just a microcosm of a political, I mean, like it's, right? So,
the whole
you know, am I optimistic? I am optimistic that I think we are all seeing that this isn't serving us.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, literally to the point where now people are dying.
Yeah.
Right. Because of partisanship. You're actually watching. It's interesting. I was talking to a leader of a global organization, a global public organization recently, and he pointed out that the countries that are faring best in the response to coronavirus are the countries that are the least politically divided.
Is that right?
So
interesting.
Wow.
Interesting.
I'm not surprised.
I mean, certainly look at the ones that are faring the worst, right? Brazil, England, US, intensely politically divided with very divisive leaders. So I hope we're reaching some kind of boiling point where things change.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One last question and then we'll let you go.
I know I got off sync with the kids' school Zoom schedule. And in about 10 seconds, all hell will break loose.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, so and Monica, I don't know, we'll just work with the time we have. So I really like what you're saying, and it's everybody's experience, right? That like when you see a person in person, that's different. And yet so I also really appreciated your point about how the opposite of hate is connection. People use hate as a way to bond. It's a bonding mechanism. And I have often wondered if the breakdown of community in America and the fact that people don't have like units, right? Like things they're already bonded to is part of what's driving all of this. And I'm just curious if you think that given, like, how can we give people a real way to bond over the opposite of hate, right? Like, because it seems like that's what's driving everything is people need connection. And so they're using hate to get there because it's efficient, honestly.
Yes.
So how do we change that?
Go ahead, Monica, what are you gonna add?
I was gonna say, how does connection go viral? How do you
I mean, right, in a sense, the problem isn't that, again, I don't think people's lived experience is matching up with what's being projected and amplified. And I don't actually, honestly, I don't know what the answer is there, right? Because, you know, this is old. If it bleeds, it leads, right? And just to be very, very clear, especially given the time we're talking in, there is a lot of coverage about death, destruction, police brutality, et cetera, that should be covered.
Certainly.
And I don't know how we change the incentives of, I mean, in the book, I explore a few examples in conjunction with leaders and folks who think about this a lot more, but fundamentally, it does come down to us, right? We say, we don't want this, we want this, but guess what we click on? We click on the garbage, we click on the hate, we click on the, right? We watch the feuds, right? So ultimately, it's this weird way in which it's sort of like, we all say we want to eat healthy and then we eat the garbage, but we know it's not good for us.
Yeah.
And then we like shake our fists at the TV. Why are they just serving us garbage? Well, so I actually think, especially in this moment, that these micro acts of kindness, compassion, and connection are ultimately the things we have to nurture and grow. And frankly, this was a bit of a harder sell before coronavirus. It's now possible to look in spite of our divisions, in spite of, the massive inequalities and injustices in our country and the way that those have been poked and prodded by our political divisions and ideological divisions. In spite of all of that, there are examples all across the country of people helping others, reaching out, connecting in spite of difference, with a sense of shared purpose, in this case, a very basic one, survival. And when we look for them, they're beautiful.
They are. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And I just, that's right. And that's the thing that keeps me going.
Easy
peasy. So not easy. We'll have to do it again so that we can, get into how completely gnarly and hard all of this is. But I really love the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us.
You guys are great. Stay safe, please.
Yes, you too. Very much so.
Good luck with the films.
Good luck. Yes.
Bye. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye, Sally. Thank you.
All right. Bye.